Welcome to the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast. The goal of the podcast is to bring to light new stories and new perspectives on mountain landscapes and mountain communities around the world, with help from a wide range of expert guests. We're going to be showcasing exciting new academic research on mountain history and some amazing work by creative practitioners engaging with mountain landscapes in a range of different media. I'm Jason Koenig from the University of St Andrews.
And I'm Jonathan Westaway from the University of Lancashire.
It's a huge pleasure today to welcome Peter Hansen. Peter is Professor of History and Director of International and Global Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. He's been a leading figure in the recent expansion of interest in mountaineering history over the last few decades. His 2013 book, The Summits of Modern Man, Mountaineering After the Enlightenment, explored the idea of the summit position. In other words, the image of the mountaineer standing alone on a mountain summit as a symbol of individual sovereignty and enlightenment. We're going to be hearing lots more about that in what follows. His many other publications include the 2024 volume, Other Everests, One Mountain, Many Worlds, jointly edited with Paul Gilchrist and, in fact, with Jonathan Westaway. So there may be some opportunities here to turn the tables a bit, and I might be quizzing Jonathan a bit as well when we get into the second half. We'll see how that goes. Peter's currently working on another book on Everest that we might touch on at the end. Welcome, Peter. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Peter, we thought we'd kick off by asking about how you came to originally work on mountains. Is it your own personal experience of mountains? Did you engage with mountaineering or hiking when you were starting out on this project?
Well, I had done a lot of hiking growing up on mountains. I wouldn't have called most of it mountain climbing, but I had done some. And after graduating from university, with some members of my family, climbed Mount Rainier. And I think I would not have thought about this topic at all but for that experience and having had done that. I was in graduate school and looking at some other topics that were not nearly so inspiring. And I managed to stumble upon this one by accident by finding an entry on the Alpine Club library in a directory of British archives. Back in the day when you looked at a printed book to find such information, I thought, there's an Alpine Club? It has a library? I'm going to go there to see if that can be a topic. And what was the connection between mountaineering and empire in the 19th century was my initial question and starting point. And so I didn't set off with some other master plan to do this. It came sort of accidentally as a combination of interests.
That's fascinating. So can we come to your book, The Summits of Modern Man, with the subtitle Mountaineering After the Enlightenment? Could you give us a summary of what you were trying to achieve with that project and maybe explain a bit more about what you mean? You mentioned this term, the summit position, as kind of defining modernity in some senses. So could you describe for our listeners what you mean by the summit position? And maybe you could give a few examples of, stories in that volume that kind of illustrate that.
Well, it started off, as I mentioned, thinking about mountaineering and empire, and had written a lot about that, and then became kind of dissatisfied with empire as the framework to look at it. It seemed like it overweighted the importance of the imperial side of this set of partnerships that you would see in every mountain, local peoples and people from elsewhere climbing. And so through a variety of accidents, you might say, modernity became to seem like a much more promising framework rather than empire, because it created more of a field in common for all the participants rather than necessarily privileging one side. And I'd been working on Mount Everest for a while, and there was a dispute over who was first on the summit, Hillary or Tenzing. And I knew of a very similar dispute on the first ascent of Mont Blanc in 1786. So 1953, 1786, two disputes where they both had the same curious resolution, where the more prominent figure asked the subaltern one, the lower one, to sign a statement that we reached the summit almost together. And I thought, well, what is going on there? Why does this thing happen? And at such a distance in time with one another, same dispute, same resolution. And that made me turn to write about Mont Blanc. I was going to be an introduction to this other book about Everest, and this became instead, what happened on Mont Blanc? And it expanded, and it was quite clear that 1786, it's a few years before the French Revolution, really breaks out this whole democratic transition, to give it the most bald summary, across Europe. And it turned out that looking at it more deeply, there was a deeply political context for this ascent. It wasn't just some people who were separate from society. There were debates over who was sovereign in Geneva and in Savoy. Debate about the removal of feudal dues, obligations to make payments to a local monastery for the village of Chamonix. So this view of who could be on top of a mountain, the summit of a mountain was kind of reserved for God or the king, the monarch. That was, the position of who was in charge, who was sovereign. And when you have popular sovereignty, the people are the sovereign, And so the ascent of Mont Blanc, I have no doubt that for one of its protagonists, Michel Gabriel Paccard, who reached the top with Jacques Balmat, his father had been in charge of the process of negotiating the feudal dues removal, which were confirmed about a month before they made the ascent. Maybe it was 2 months. I don't say this quite as baldly in the book, but there's a deep and profound connection between these two processes. And then some of the other people involved were the leading characters in Geneva in trying to redefine who is a citizen. So the summit position was kind of literal and metaphorical. Literal, like who's on top of a summit. But one time writing part of the chapter, one of these pieces, it's like, I think I was playing with what some scholars call the subject position. What is the position that someone speaks from and makes them an individual and gives them a sense of purpose? So, and I'm typing along, and the subject position was the dominant blah, blah, and I just that's the book. That is the argument of the book in a nutshell, in a phrase. So the summit position, though, is critical, and you can see it in different places across a longer period of time. And these Summits of Modern Men book then followed this trajectory of debates about that first ascent. What led up to it, and how is it remembered and recalled? And you could see quite clearly that the summit position was about the assertion of individual will. So, individual's person, they made it to the top because they were the one responsible. They didn't have anything to do with anybody else. That's why you have these disputes over who was first. Because even if you had two people who made it to the top, they couldn't have done it without the other. There's assumption, societally, culturally, that one person is responsible. And so even though this summit is something that could be shared, it was thought of as being separate from, and had to be just one. Therefore, who was first? They're stepping on the top literally seconds apart from each other or at the same time, or, there's lots of different, in a literal sense, ways to define who was first. But they do it as a kind of collective, collaborative, a joint process. And the ways we talk about that are difficult to do in the way people had written about it, was just about one person.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's what is so stunning about the book, really, I think, is that extension of the concept of statecraft and polity and incorporating mountains into the civic, that you reveal within the book. That's what I found so fantastic about it. So.
Well, thanks. Because, to give listeners who might not have seen it, you do see these political resonances or echoes about sovereignty later on. In the mid-19th century, you have unified Italy and Germany and new states. France takes a different shape. Its boundaries change to include Chamonix in the 1860s. The climbing of the Alps for the first time, that is in the golden age of mountaineering, as it's often called, was often mostly done by British climbers, much to the great disappointment of people in other parts of Europe. The Italians in a mountaineering museum in Turin have this, big panorama of the Alps where all the peaks are labeled and who climbed it. And, they're very disappointed that there's so many British up there. And the Italians wanted to climb, say, the Matterhorn first, to show that this was a symbol of the new Italian nation. They didn't. They sent up a team that raced with the British against on opposite sides of the peak. But that was very important. And because some of the leading figures in the Italian mountaineering community want to make Italians by sending their climbers to the top. And much the same thing happens in the 1950s in the Himalayas, where after an independent India, you have the celebration of Hillary and Tenzing, and in Nepal and in India, Tenzing is the figure who's celebrated. And he's in part celebrated by Nehru, because Nehru tells him, I want you to make 1,000 Tenzings. And what he meant was 1,000 Italians who were coming from these diverse points of view to show that India in its unity embraced all this diversity. of the various peoples who lived in the territory of the nation state that was now new, after its independence. And so you get these at different points. You can see it either in national celebrations with the bicentennial of the ascent of Mont Blanc in the 1980s and afterwards, in France and Italy and other places.
Can I just jump in a bit and ask a little bit more about some of the characters and some of those famous incidents from mountaineering history that you were touching on there? That first ascent of Mont Blanc is a fantastic example, I think. If you're going to write about these things, you have to immerse yourself in the writings of these amazing figures from 19th century mountaineering history. In some cases, really powerful, distinctive voices. And I mean, I've been rereading some of this recently for helping with a PhD project, which I'm very lucky to be supervising. Just rereading people like Whymper and Tyndall and Leslie Stephen and others. Obviously, in the book, you're really bringing to life brilliantly some of those characters and some of those incredible moments. But my sense is that you're also, in a sense, trying to step back from them. You're trying to tell that story a little bit differently with reference to national feeling, empire, as you say, rather than replicating this idea of mountaineering history as a story about various charismatic individuals, again, standing on summits. I just wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit more about that tension, and how do you feel the work you've done here, how do you relate that to earlier ways of dealing with mountaineering history, particularly in the 20th century?
When I started this, I was reading those people you mentioned, and they're that generation of the British climbers. And there's a lot of writing about mountaineering that's very much driven by the self-identification of the historian or the person writing with these figures in the past. And I didn't really feel that so much. I always tried to keep a distance from that, as you were kind of hinting at. I certainly didn't see myself as like Whymper or Tyndall. Stephen was a little more of an academic-y type. So, there's a kind of sense of irony there that is the mode of a lot of history writing. When I did climb the Matterhorn while I was doing my dissertation, it was following this adage that historians need not just more documents, but stronger boots. I thought, let's try that. Let's do this, and went with a guide. And not so much after that, as I often say, because came back and my wife asked me shortly after that ascent and shortly before the birth of our first child, well, you're done now, right? I said, yes. And I kept my promise, unlike a lot of other almost invariably white male, mountaineers who are so addicted to danger that they keep going back. Some of the other people who wrote about the first ascent of Mont Blanc in the 1950s, Gavin De Beer and Thomas Graham Brown, deeply identified with the climber, especially Graham Brown, who was a doctor, who identified with Dr. Packard and was outraged that Dr. Packard was not getting the credit he deserved. And this was true of a number of the prior British mountaineers who wrote about this history. It's a deep identification with these figures in the past. You can see that more recently, especially someone like Mallory. George Mallory is found by Conrad Anker, and Anker sits there next to his body and says, "Oh, I'm just like him. We're two mountaineers, and we're, just separated. We're the same people, separated by this, 75 years." And just think there's this sense of similarity and difference across time is attention, like you were mentioning. Anybody struggles with when writing about the past. So there's always a connection from present to past, but sometimes those can be overdrawn or seem to erase the differences between them and us, if you will. So, that was reflected in differences of the mode of writing. Graham Brown and De Beer's book is very empiricist. It's about the triumph of will, this individual who goes and conquers the mountain and becomes first, and it should be celebrated that. And if they're not, they have to write the historical record. And there's a lot of that from the late 19th century through to the present, really. But, as a mode of history, that's the dominant one, say, into the 1960s, 50s, 60s.
And I think we'll talk a bit more about that process of kind of heroization which dominates mountaineering narratives when we talk about Everest in a few minutes. I just wanted to, you've talked about the framing device of modernity in the book, which kind of unlocked the project for you. But there's another framing device which you use, which is reflecting on the Anthropocene and climate change within the book. These are mountain spaces. We know currently they're being exponentially adversely affected by climate change. So I just wondered, could you say a bit more about the contemporary context and whether you think that looking at mountaineering history can in any way help us think about or address contemporary problems in mountain spaces?
Sure. If, as I was implying, there's always these connections in the past and can often change as the particular angle, emphasis we give to something. And we find something greater relevance than people did in the past because we've changed how we think. The changing climate that we have was something that a lot of people looking at histories of mountains and mountaineering are now, it's in the forefront of our present, and therefore you want to explore these connections. And these debates about who was first seemed to resonate as I was finishing that book with these debates about the Anthropocene and strange debates about who discovered the Anthropocene. Were like straight out of the same playbook. But there was also this notion that, hey, we are the dominant figure on the planet, and so we should control the planet. We should just embrace the Anthropocene and do geoengineering. And it seemed like another version, displaced into a different domain of this will to dominate nature that we'd seen in the 19th century in the initial, let's go climb all the peaks, or even to some extent in the 18th century when people like Saussure are going out to try to understand how the mountains are formed. There's lots of really great writing inspired by this sort of thing, which takes a different tack than I did in Summits of Modern Man, like eco-criticism as a point of view. Caroline Schaumann writes a great book on focusing on 19th century mountaineering that brings that angle to the forefront. There's a lot of really great work being inspired in that direction, things of mountain film. But commercialization is a debate that's ongoing in the present that is part of what I think about because that comes so prominent on Mount Everest, but it was a part of the debates over 19th century mountaineering. And it's striking how many of the really influential figures in this history are the popularizers, the people who are very commercial. Albert Smith in the 1850s does a super popular show about his ascent of Mont Blanc in the West End of London. It inspires social climbers to become mountain climbers in London. They go to the Alps. In the 18th century, Theodore Marc Boury was the great popularizer. His works were read by way more people than Saussure's. And he was also, a figure like this. And so it's sometimes the popularization that comes, whether it's from John Krakauer or other writers about Everest or mountaineering more recently, that's what people read. It's a huge, popular, extremely influential cultural dynamic. And so those sorts of things, the influence of social media today is one that people are studying, Himalayas and on Mount Everest. It's a different context, but you can learn from what's happened in the past, whether it's Everest or someplace else.
Fantastic, thanks. We started talking about Everest already, almost inevitably. So actually, I wonder if at this stage, if we could move on and talk a little bit about the amazing other Everest volume, which came out last year, 2024, Manchester University Press. Subtitle is One Mountain, Many Worlds, just from a whole range of different perspectives, trying to foreground some new voices, new perspectives on the history of Everest. So you just start just by telling us a little bit about how that volume came about, maybe how it relates to your earlier work, Peter.
I mean, Jonathan deserves most of the credit for bringing together the other Everest crew, but I would say it came about by trying to represent what its title says. What are the multiple perspectives and ways of looking at this mountain? And Jonathan, you want to say anything about where the...
Yeah, it started out with support from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK for a research network, which came together around the centenaries of the first British Everest expeditions. So those were in 2021, 2022, 2024, which was the kind of big centenary, the centenary of the disappearance of Mallory and Irvine, which has been, at the forefront in narratives around Everest. And we really wanted to recontextualize commemorative practices around those centenaries, start to question some of the late imperial meta-narratives that still stuck to the story of Everest, particularly about white heroic imperial masculinity as being the only story in town. And so we particularly wanted to research the hidden histories of indigenous high altitude workers on these early expeditions. So the Sherpas and other ethnic groups that worked on these expeditions and made them possible. Yeah, so we brought a network together. We had scholars from the global south. Peter did a fantastic plenary at a workshop we did at the Royal Geographical Society. Yeah, and the book emerged from that process.
I wonder if we just dig into this question about the way in which you've integrated the perspectives of local people within that volume. I mean, obviously, it's part of a broader movement which has seen Indigenous people reclaiming the histories of their own mountain regions, opening up new attention to, for example, the role of Indigenous workers in mountaineering history. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about how you as editors and writers navigate through the challenge of trying to open up a space for non-Western voices, while also at the same time inevitably writing from a position of distance, I guess, at least a Western perspective. I mean, obviously, one of the things you do is to involve non-Western scholars in the project. Could you say a little bit more about those tensions and how the book relates to that broader movement?
I suppose there's a couple things to say. Is certainly today, Mount Everest is being reclaimed or being claimed by local communities, and that has been going on for a long time. And so the book is a way to show some of these longer histories where the local communities were present and critical and contributing and sometimes resisting, sometimes collaborating, and a whole range of responses that had not been very apparent, but they're available if you look for them. And so that finding these hidden histories in the archives or looking against the archival grain of the ways that Jonathan was just talking about. That's one thing to say. The other piece is that Everest is a transnational space. You can see in its name, Everest, and Chomolungma, and Sagarmatha. You really can't write its history just from a local perspective. It is this piece that requires a wide peripheral vision in trying to identify or look at this subject. And so that's its challenge. And that's what makes it such an interesting place to look at, to figure out what's going on for globalization and all the range of issues of trying to provide space for non-Western voices or perspectives and scholars. I think this is a step toward doing that. It's not a one-time thing and that is done. It's an ongoing one.
I mean, another thing we were very conscious of was there are fundamentally different perspectives on the mountain. Imperial cartographies and toponyms came along and overwrote Indigenous ways of understanding the mountain and Indigenous names for the mountain. But, in the first chapter, Ruth Gamble from La Trobe University talks about the mountain as the abode of the goddess Myo Lang Sangma in Tibetan Buddhist theology, which is a way that many Sherpas in the region and Tibetans in the region still understand the mountain. They have a fundamentally ontological different relationship with the mountain. So that's what we were trying to get at with the subtitle Many Worlds. Also, another key part of the book was the importance of archives and how we could mobilize knowledge from the archives to help us tell these histories of the Indigenous high-altitude workers. And in particular, because they were largely illiterate and were written out of Western accounts of these expeditions, we have to use visual methods and oral history methods to research their histories and biographies. So archives, and particularly the very rich image archives, photographs and films at the Royal Geographical Society, became central to the project. And in one of the chapters, Felix Driver from Royal Holloway, University of London, talks about this idea of reanimating the archive, that actually within those late imperial archives, there's material there which exceeds the expectations of the people who collected those archives, and we can actually use them to tell these hidden histories.
Fantastic. I might come back to another question about the photographs in a moment, but maybe before I do that, maybe I could just ask you, but maybe this is a question for Peter in particular. Just wanted to ask a little bit more, I suppose, about the methodological underpinning or the theoretical underpinning. And clearly, post-colonial perspectives are really important in your work generally, not just in your work on Everest. Just wonder if you could say just a little bit more about the kind of frameworks you're using and perhaps also about the influences on your work from outside mountain studies as well.
Well, over the longer trajectory or intellectual biography, when I started this, it was more history from below. Is in a British tradition. I was situated in British history, kind of Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and so forth. And as you go global, following the British climbers elsewhere, particularly to the Himalayas, subaltern studies became a very important influence on my work, trying to figure out how do you make sense of these people who seem to have no voice, but who do have a voice, and navigating that. And Deepesh Chakrabarty, for example, who'd been part of that subaltern studies collective, wrote a particularly influential book on provincializing Europe, which it takes both what is happening in Europe and tries to make it not the subject of history, that there is these histories that happen elsewhere. And when I turned to the Summits of Modern Man into mostly about European history, really the goal of that book was to provincialize Europe from within, from the perspective of its highest peaks. And the Annales School in France, what turns out, because they're not far from the mountains, they often write about the mountains. And so by the end of the Summits book, I was in dialogue with, what had come from that tradition, from people like Marc Bloch saying, man is the subject of history because he's on nature's summit. He didn't care at all about histories of volcanoes or geology. And that's precisely what some people say is now they're enmeshed. Humans are on the geological actor timeline. And others, like Leroy Ladurie, writing about climate, by going to the Alps and measuring the glaciers and watching them recede and their histories. And so that's part of mountain studies, and it's very important, the glaciological research about understanding deep time and change over a planetary scale. That's part of mountaineering history. Ladurie complained that to do this history, you had to look into the archives of some obscure Teutonic Alpine club, to find out what was going on. But yeah, you do. And so that was an interesting way to do it. These days, I'd say the fields I'm interested in are studies of race and gender in the wider world. And a book that I think everybody should read is White Freedom by Tyler Stovall. He's an American historian of France. And this book argues that, whiteness was equated to freedom and liberty and autonomy, which in sort of obvious ways in the 19th century, as you have abolition of slavery, but more generally to the present. And I think there's connections with what happens there and elsewhere in mountains.
Fantastic. Yeah, I guess we might come back to that in a moment in talking about the next Everest project. But before we do, I just wanted to return briefly to the photographs that we were mentioning earlier that Jonathan raised, partly because I particularly enjoyed last summer going to see the amazing Other Everests exhibition at Ray Castle in the Lake District. It was really wonderful to see all the old photos from those Everest expeditions and just thinking about the way in which they give us one window onto the lived experience of people who lived and worked on Everest, not just Western explorers, but also local people whose voices have been more or less lost from view until now. And so, yeah, I just wondered whether maybe it's a question for both of you, actually, whether you might be able to say a little bit more about the role of that exhibition in the project, but maybe more widely about the role of photography in mountain history generally in other regions too.
Certainly on the Everest expeditions, photography was front and center in terms of propaganda. It was used to promote those expeditions, to generate funds. The films that John Noel made in 1922, climbing Mount Everest, and then in 1924, the Epic of Everest, were highly commercial undertakings. Peter's written fantastically about the controversies around the 1924 film and some of the intercultural misunderstandings which led to a rupture with the Tibetan government. So the first film that was ever shot in Tibet was shot on Everest as part of these expeditions. But inadvertently, as part of this process, there's all this rich historical material about the presence of the indigenous workforce there. And then photographs are taken as well and commissioned on these expeditions, and they've gone into the archive. And I suppose one of the hopes for the Other Everest project was always that we could use kind of digital repatriation techniques, that we could reanimate the archive, but we could also make it accessible with our project partners, Royal Geographical Society, to the communities who feature in those archives. And that's quite difficult to do. The RGS has got a great track record of doing this. I wanted to put on an exhibition in the Lake District in the UK because it would reach the kind of mountaineering community, the outdoor community in the UK. And it would present them with a different perspective on these expeditions. Mostly the press just wants to talk about Mallory and Irvine, but here was this incredibly rich, high quality archive, which shows you that there were interpreters who were critical for these expeditions. None of the Westerners spoke Tibetan on these expeditions. The only reason these expeditions operated because there were people like Chetan Wangdi and Karma Paul who acted as brokers, as interlocutors. And we talked a bit about this with Lachlan the other day about his book, Science on the Roof of the World, the critical importance of indigenous intermediaries. So, and the photographs are so strong, the portraiture is so strong that the humanity of these individuals comes through very well. We blew the photographs up to a huge size. They were kind of meter size and backlit, and they were very, very powerful. But we've also been working with a group of young scholars and activists in Kalimpong in West Bengal called the Confluence Collective, who do fantastic work in Darjeeling and Kalimpong, researching family archives that contain stories of people who worked on these early expeditions. So they've interviewed the family of the Sherpa Sirdar Ang Sering, they've interviewed the family of Chetan Wangdi, and they're going to put on an exhibition in Kalimpong later this year in a market space so that local people can come and access archival images from the Royal Geographical Society archive. And for the first time, really, in that place where these expeditions set out from, they're going to be able to see archival photographs from these expeditions. So we're really looking forward to that.
That'll be a fantastic opportunity to have those photographs exhibited in the Himalayas. And that's really a great example of the kind of thing everybody would like to do. And it's so hard, and it's wonderful that you've been able to do it. The photographs and the visual record in films and otherwise is critical. I mean, at one point, doing this research, I thought, when writing about that Everest film, that one of the great opportunities for writing about something in the 20th century is to use film as a source. You don't have that in the 19th century. The classicists don't have that for something back, a millennia ago. So, and take it seriously as a source. And one of the things that's so powerful about photograph or the film is its visual presence. You can see something about these people in the past, in their life, their existence, their contributions, that's just more powerful when you see it, as it were, face to face. There's a bit at the end, The Summits of Modern Man, where I discuss the discovery of a Neolithic Iceman in the Alps who's brought back, and there's controversies about him. But the people who were curating the exhibitions and the way he's displayed said, yes, we really want to give history a human face. And that's what he was able to do when they created a kind of wax figure reproductions. And those always, depict what we imagine someone to be or what some artist imagines them to be. But that's part of the historical imagination. I mean, what is so interesting about history is that you are dealing with making meaning from things where you have an imperfect record more often than you don't have every detail, but you've got something, and then you want to make sense of it and make meaning out of it. And the photographs help. They give you something you don't get from other sources. Strike a kind of a chord, however you want to think about it, an emotional one, a kind of visceral, an embodied one that's different from just reading text on a page.
Can we perhaps focus on the future a bit and the future of your research, Peter? What role do mountains play in your thinking about next steps in terms of the research you'd like to undertake?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm stuck with mountains. I'm not stuck with them, but that's my niche, and it's one I'm happy to be in. But I'm writing about Mount Everest, and like the prior research, kind of shifted perspective that I thought, I'm going to write about commercialization in Mount Everest, and I still am, but in a different way, as the focus has more been about whiteness of Mount Everest, or whiteness on Mount Everest, and that history of, let's say, a transition from the mountain representing kind of Sahib supremacy in India, which it clearly did from the name Mount Everest into its early expeditions in the 1920s. Your vantage point is the 2020s, and you read some of the stuff they wrote in the 1920s. It's shocking, but not surprising that they were deeply racist in ways that, may not have seemed as apparent to me, doing this research 30 years ago, but it's sort of like a neon sign blinking at you right now. And so how do we write a history that takes that seriously and shows what the transitions are so that this summit position of Mount Everest that people would like to claim for themselves is something that's now claimed for a wide variety of people. And part of what they're claiming are the kind of privileges that were formerly considered restricted to white folk. And so that's the direction of travel for the research that's ongoing right now. And it's consistent with this. It's one of many possible approaches, we'll say. The other Everests talked about the many worlds, so there's many different ways to approach it. And I'm not saying this is the only thing that matters on Mount Everest, but I think it's one that can help us illuminate our times today.
Fantastic. Thank you. we're coming to the end of our talk. I mean, broadening this out a bit, what opportunities do you see for the future of what we might call the mountain humanities? How would you like your own work to make a difference in some of these Himalayan communities we've talked about? Do you think there is scope for the work that we do as historians, anthropologists, geographers, to really have resonance for the communities in the region today?
Well, as far as how my work might contribute to the communities, it's difficult to say, although I think you want to clear a space in which people see that it's possible to dream of a more sustainable and equitable Mount Everest, Chomolungma, Sagarmatha, than we have thought possible. So that is the objective of the work I'm doing now, and that's not addressed mainly to people in the area, but to show more generally how that might be possible. The opportunities that you're asking about more generally, we can always revisit things that people have written about in the past. There's always more to be said. But I think some of the things that haven't been as addressed as directly are really kind of comparative ones in time or space. One of the things that's most exciting about what Jason's doing with the classicists and Greek mountains is the legacy that they have still for us today that are more directly relevant than we might have thought. Don Hollis, too, looking at the early modern period and how it still has something to say to us because it's not just, something to be ignored and jumped over from the classical to the modern period. But apart from those, kind of temporal comparisons, across place, there's lots of interesting work about mountains in Japan and Korea and China, and the conference not too long ago about Asia and the Alps, kind of comparison of Switzerland and Japan. Really fruitful and exciting. In the Americas, there's great Canadian historians writing about the transformation of the Rockies. And there's this history of an indigenous presence, the First Nations of North America, who are still there and, but had a similar story about the local names being erased and so forth. And that dynamic is present certainly in South America as well as other parts of the world, but it's in multimedia. There was a fantastic television program on in the United States recently, on a series called Sacred Planet with Gulnaz Khan about Colombia and the message to the world from the indigenous people there about their mountains and how they relate to their mountains, the Hurako people. And that kind of amplification, if you want, of the perspectives that we were trying to get to in other Everests can be done in many places and over many timescales. We fixed on that one spot and had this period of roughly a century from these early British expeditions to Everest, but with the longer history, of its naming and its mapping and so forth. But Jan Mathieu, the great Swiss historian of mountains, has written about the sacred mountain, and there's a lot there. I mean, this Sacred Planet was part of that same sort of thing. There's an argument that was in Summits of Modern Man that Jan had made in some of his work too, that really this notion that mountains are sacred is a modern idea. It's one that's produced in dialogue with all the scientific research and everything else that's happening. It's not something just from classical period or biblical or some remote time in the past that's getting overcome by modernity, but it's being produced today, it's being transformed today. And how do you write about that? I mean, Pasang Yangji Sherpa, who's one of the great anthropologists of the Sherpa, who is Sherpa herself, gave a talk at Columbia University last year or two and talked about the environment and climate change and in the Himalayas and that, among other things. How do we write history of this place that leaves room for our gods, for the Sherpa gods of Everest or the other peaks in the Himalayas? And there is still room for the many worlds that fit on the mountains, as we kind of termed it in the other Everests, many worlds.
It's really interesting to hear what you're saying there, Peter, about stretching out both the geographical scope and also the chronological scope of mountain history. And I'm just thinking about how that works for the Himalayas in particular. We talked in another podcast episode, which will be available alongside yours, with Lachlan Fleetwood, about the early 19th century history of the Himalaya, which is, I think, clearly a less well-known period of Himalayan history. But I'm just wondering about I guess it's probably hard to write a conventional Western style history of the Himalaya and of Everest into those pre-modern centuries, looking back into but for hundreds, even thousands of years before that. But there must nevertheless be a strong sense of the antiquity of those spaces and the fact that they do have a history, they do have a past that is still very important in the present. And it's a past that's much more than just 200 years old. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not just mythological. Sometimes the accounts that you have, people don't trust them, put trust in quotation marks. They're not sure what to make of them. So it tells you something, and it's worth exploring what it means.
Great. We're going to wrap up there. Thank you to Peter. Thanks to Sophia Gertin for editing. Thanks also to our listeners for joining us. We've got lots of other episodes coming up over the next few weeks. We're going to be exploring a whole range of new perspectives on mountain history and mountain experience. If you'd like to support the project, please do share our podcasts with others. If you'd like to join in the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures, or get in touch directly via the project website. The links are there in the episode notes. Thank you for listening.